Hey folks, welcome to a season 3 finale episode of the Evolving Leader podcast. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, John?
I am feeling, when I reflect back over this show, I'm feeling a huge amount of satisfaction and gratitude, because having listened to all the shows back to back over the weekend, I felt the scope of our agenda in terms of thinking about what an evolving leader means we're fulfilling, and I'm very excited about what we do next. So I'm feeling good. I'm feeling very satisfied, and I'm feeling a tremendous amount of gratitude to you, to Phil, and to every guest and our audience as well. So how are you feeling, Scott?
I resonate with all of that. I woke up feeling incredibly tired. It's been a very long week, and so I kind of was sheepishly sort of coming to the mic today. But, you know, as soon as we switch on and we get going, I'm just always immediately energized. So I feel a ton of gratitude that we get to do this, and it's just incredible honor to be part of it. So you mentioned you went through all the episodes last week, and so let's maybe just start at the top and kind of talk through what we think are some of the highlights. Yeah. So we started season 3 with the brilliant Rita McGrath, whose work on discovery-driven growth and innovation has consistently delivered really fresh insights into the field for the past 20 years.
Yeah, let's start there. Let's tune into her thoughts about how the people agenda is changing in the tour of duty era.
So I think the first observation I would make is that our model for careers has really changed. That increasingly today we're in what Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye have famously called the tour of duty economy, where you sign up with an organization. But remember, these organizations, the thing you signed up for may not exist 5 years from now. So you sign up, you have a tour of duty that you engage in. And when it's done, you might decide to sign up for another tour. You might decide to leave. You might decide to come back. One of the interesting things we're seeing now is this phenomena where people are coming and going from firms. So alumni are returning, and firms are paying much more attention to their alumni networks now, which is absolutely fascinating. And so in a way, your network is becoming more valuable than whatever organization you happen to be temporarily associated with, which is quite stunning when you think about it. So for HR, it's a question of, how do I find talent? How do I find diverse talent? That is a big item on the agenda right now. And then how do I make sure that talent is up against the right opportunities? And it becomes almost like an air traffic control job, where you're connecting skills and capabilities that people have with things that the organization needs. And that really requires almost an architectural skill to be able to say, oh, you know, I've got this venture that's ready to go into acceleration. I've got 4 people who I know can do that job. Let's put them on this. And so it's a much more hands-on, much more central to the strategy execution part of the business than it's ever been. And I don't know that we're really equipping a lot of HR people with what they need to be able to do that, because they need to understand the strategy very clearly. They need to have really deep insight into who's good at what. They need to then be able to have the power. Like, let's say you've got a superstar manager who's reporting to Division B, and you really need some superstar like that to promote this venture. You've got to take that superstar away from the management of Division B, who, by the way, they have an important, powerful, meaningful job over there, and move them to where they can do the best good for the organization. That is hard. And that means you need power. You need power. And so with tremendous responsibility comes tremendous power, comes tremendous need to exercise that in a benevolent way for the corporation. Lou Gerstner once said, typical companies put their best people on problems. Exceptional companies put their best people on opportunities. And fundamentally, that's at the heart of the HR leader of the future's job.
Yeah, I had to really suppress my fanboy urges when Kevin Kelly, co-founder of Wired magazine, joined us. I'd been a huge devotee of the title when it captured the web zeitgeist in the mid-90s.
And I was impressed because I've never seen you suppress your fanboy urges before. So that was something. And I loved his memories of advising Steven Spielberg on the Future for Minority Report. I thought that was really cool.
You advised Steven Spielberg on Minority Report. What was that experience like, and what do you think 2050 is going to look like now? I mean, we've pointed at it a little bit, but
yeah. He recruited a bunch of us together into a hotel for a weekend to try to imagine the year 2050, and many things that from that room made it into the movie, many didn't. I learned the one thing I learned from him, from Spielberg, about that experience was really, really kind of cool in terms of thinking about the future, was that, as I said, futurists like to wave their arms and make general trends. And he said, no, this doesn't work for me. I have to film this. I have to have very, very specific things. I want to know, what does the bedroom look like? I want to know what you can eat for breakfast. And so that kind of being very, very specific, forced an interesting exercise in, being wrong and making up things, but that going that specific was actually a useful exercise. And so I learned from him that while it's, in the end, you can only make general trends, it is a useful exercise along the way to try and like say, well, what does the music sound like in 2015? What are they going to be playing in the background? Are they going to be playing instruments? What does that look like? And so those kinds of questions, like kind of the museum of the future idea, is a really good, useful exercise to go through.
That's a very cool thing to have done.
And Tim Lomas brought a fascinating set of ideas. And we talked about this in our Under the Hood episode a little bit, all about how our language and emotions interact.
Yeah, and his project, the lexicography of untranslatable words, really opened up an interesting conversation about how different cultures think about and describe how they feel.
Our whole phenomenological terrain is so complex and detailed. It's such a... One metaphor I like to try and use with respect to like language is, a navigational metaphor around cartography, around mapping our inner world. So I think, one function of language is to map our worlds, like the world around us, and also our inner world of thoughts and feelings and sensations and so on. And then a model I've found helpful in terms of what these worlds are like. There's a theorist, I think, Jürgen Fell, has a model called a state-space approach, where our inner world and also our external world could be seen as a state space of any number of dimensions. So it's not just two dimensions, let's say valence and arousal, but there's many other dimensions, potentially meaning and intensity and duration and so on. You could imagine this really complex internal space that's n-dimensional, not just 2 or 3, but n dimensions. And then in that context, I think language serves to delineate regions of this inner space by drawing boundaries around these regions, and then here's where you get into theories like social constructionism, this idea that the boundaries imposed are somewhat arbitrary, so you can look at the way real geographical map of the world. You take the complexity of the world and you draw boundaries around certain regions to create countries and regions, and that's somewhat arbitrary, not entirely, because there's obviously natural phenomena like seas and rivers that can divide regions, but the imposition of boundaries could be considered somewhat arbitrary. So then here's where that also links with theories around culture, because there's a whole other tradition of theories often referred to as a linguistic relativity hypothesis, or sometimes the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which suggests that language, at least to some extent, influences how we perceive and experience and understand the world.
And who could forget? I know I can't. Will Page, former chief economist at Spotify, entertained and informed us in equal measure.
And his book, Tarzan Economics, describes how certain industries seem like Tarzan to be swinging from one withering vine of revenues to a new one just in time.
Yeah, I found that really insightful. And he talked a lot about how to have the confidence to let go of that old vine in the face of uncertainty and then actually reach out for the new one.
Yeah, as an 11-year-old kid, there was some sibling rivalry. My older brother had been taught what economics was, and I was jealous. I wanted to catch up. So I asked my dad, a maths and economics teacher, Dad, what's economics? And, he was like, this is my summer holidays. As a school teacher, he had long summer holidays. And he's like, I'm not going to go into work during my holidays. No. He said, Dad, we're at the beach and I got to know what economics is. And he said, oh, no, we're not going to discuss work while I'm on my holidays. So Dad, you've got to tell me. My brother knows I need to know. Tell me what economics is. So we're sitting at this beach a beach called Pease Bay, south of Edinburgh and north of Berwick. Very famous for surfing now. Back in those days, we're just there in our swimming trunks getting tossed around in waves. Now it's big surfers and wetsuits. And we were there at this beach, and he said to me, right, son, let's pretend you're the Prime Minister of this country. Okay, big ask, but let's go with it. He said, I'm going to give you a tragic story, which is kids are drowning in British beaches all over the place. More and more stories of fatalities in British beaches with British children drowning in British beaches. And you're going to be the Prime Minister. You're going to walk out at number 10 Downing Street. You're going to stare grieving parents in the face. You're going to stare hostile politicians in the face. You're going to stare an angry press corps in the face. And you, Billy Page, are going to tell them exactly what you're going to do to solve this problem of British kids drowning in British beaches. Now, I was 11. You know the story, obviously, but as adults today, my solution then is largely what adults say today. This is my idea. I came up with the idea of make swimming compulsory. That'll solve the problem. Okay, that's politics, son. Now we'll do some economics. This is so relevant in the time of a pandemic. Does your solution make the problem worse? And so I said, okay, apply the economics, Dad. He said, well, what do we know about the kids? Well, they're at the beach, Dad. Okay, where were they at the beach? They were in the water, Dad. What does that tell you about their ability to swim or not? That means they could swim, Dad. Why? Because kids who can't swim don't go into water. The penny dropped. So your policy is to make all kids, those kids who can't swim, all kids will be able to swim. Yes, Dad. Will we have more or less kids in the water as a result of your policy? We'll have more, Dad. And if 0.001% of them die fatally through drowning, will we have more or less deaths as a result? And my face just went cold white. I was making the problem worse. The best intentions of might and men, I tried to solve the problem, but I was going to make it worse. And I got really upset. It's like, I gave that my best shot, Dad, and I've screwed up. What's the solution? He talked about information, being aware where those dangerous currents are, a flag system, which wasn't there at that time, red, amber, green. And regulation, making sure kids have to be accompanied by parents into water, make sure there's lifeguards at present. But making swimming compulsory was not the solution to this problem. It was going to take something else. So that was fascinating for me then. It's been fascinating for every single person who's been hired by Spotify, because I used that story in my induction talk for new hires, and everybody was just like, I get it. It's abstraction. But here's the twist. So 2006, I moved to London to start this career in the music industry. And like you, the general counsel of the PRS asked me the exact same question. How did you get into economics, Will? And I told the general counsel, a lawyer, economists and lawyers don't see eye to eye on many things, in fact, just about everything. I told this lawyer the story of my dad teaching me what economics was on the beach. This was my ambition for the rest of my career, to be an economist. And we got to the conclusion of it, and I said to her, well, my solution was make swimming compulsory. What would have been your solution? And you know what the lawyer said to me?
No.
She said, I'd just ban the kids from swimming.
We had so much fun with Todd Kashdan. He's one of the world's leading experimental psychologists.
Yeah, I loved having him on. He is super playful and open and irreverent, and I know we're both really looking forward to reading his book, The Art of Insubordination, which I think may have already dropped.
Yeah, it's just come out.
Yeah, can't wait to get into that. You talked a moment ago about moving from a persuading mindset to a learning mindset, and now you're telling the story about applying curiosity to figure out what's going on, which I absolutely love. It actually came up in a workshop I was in the other day. It was all around sort of, self-discovery, self-awareness, and awareness of other people, and the question was posed, well, what do I do? How do I stay with that? How do I actually learn more about other people and myself? And my response was stay curious, number one, right? Be curious about yourself, be curious about other people, be curious about their experiences. But it's easier said than done. Is there any sort of advice that you might have in a practical way of adopting that mindset of curiosity?
Yeah. And Scott, I like how you're connecting the dots between these seemingly disparate situations of political partisanship and cutting up a watermelon in my household. So, I mean,
I could see them being linked quite strongly.
Yeah, they are. I mean, Even as I've been talking so far, there's a lot of actually practical points if you pick apart the pieces that I'm kind of pulling out. I mean, the thing about curiosity is it's not like these books on happiness where they'll tell you that, it's your decision to decide to be happy or not. There's a book, Happy for No Reason, which it always just drives me crazy as a scientist of, no, there's usually a reason. And if it's your mood, you don't know what mood you're going to be in, but that's not the same thing as happiness. Curiosity is a little bit different. So happiness isn't a thermostat where you could turn it higher and lower on demand. Curiosity, you can, because it's really about the direction of attention. And it's really about the quality of the attention that you're directing. So the first part is to deconstruct what curiosity is. Because Scott, just as you're saying, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, I'm glad everyone in the world is talking about being curious now. I mean, I've been researching this since 2001. So I'm glad people are caught up, but you're right. We have to go beyond saying being curious. So part of it is directing attention with intention and realizing that you can modify the quality of your attention. So you could have this gentle sense of wonder in this conversation right now. Like, I have no idea. You could take this in any direction. You didn't send me questions. I told you can ask me anything because I'm from New York City and I have totally comfortable talking about provocative conversation topics. So I can have a sense of trying to control myself and how I behave with the hope that I come across as intelligent, as competent, as socially appropriate and acceptable, and I realize it's not binary, or I can have this gentleness, less pressure on myself, really paying attention to what you're asking, really thinking about, okay, where can we take and pull this in new directions? Because, Jean, Scott, and myself, like, none of us have gotten together before. We're creating something as a team dynamic that's happening here.
Steve Ingham, the performance scientist, gave us a really different take on well-being. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I mean, he's trained over 1,000 athletes, including numerous gold-winning Olympians. And he's taken that experience in many different domains, including corporate life, and come up with some very, very interesting new ways of thinking about well-being.
What I see people doing in work is doing 5-hour meetings, 10-hour Zooms nowadays, where the prefrontal cortex is exhausted from the effort and the work. And so very simply asking the question, if we were performance focused, how would we structure our day is a critical question.
Leanne Infante, who's now married, on the show she was Leanne Riley, is a regular member of the England women's rugby international team, and she talked to us about leadership on and off the pitch.
I was a bit envious of you as I was listening back because, as you know, I wasn't able to be part of that one, but it was a really insightful conversation. And given the growing success of sports previously dominated by men, there's a lot to consider in how athletes are paving the way in a more equal world.
When I was a late teen coming into adult rugby, I read a book called Legacy from James Kerr. And it's all about the All Blacks and their successes and their processes and how they've got to where they are or were at the time. So I think I've taken a lot from that book around how they conduct themselves away from the field and what that looks like. And then again, how they utilise and maximise leaders within the squad on the field. But yeah, it's probably not an individual person. It's more either people within my own team and taking little bits from them or just reading. But that book I was reading it at a time where things weren't going right in rugby, funnily enough, and I just needed to have a little bit of separation. And I thought, let's stick my head in a book and see if that changes my perspective. And yeah, it definitely opened my eyes up to a couple of different things.
What was the biggest takeaway for you?
I think the off the field stuff around the community and the junior rugby in New Zealand is structured totally different to ours here. And the way they go from club to school, back to club, and how the All Blacks had a role within that, whether that was them growing up within that role or a couple of years later, how they kept in touch with their communities. You see a lot around, it's just natural to them and it's within their culture and it's part of their culture and the way they they see that and they relate that to the outside. And I think being able to take that into my coaching with the girls that I coach, and whether it's coming off the field and thanking all the fans within the stand and being accessible there, having conversations, inspiring the number of girls that are playing rugby now, because that's a way higher than what, when I was growing up. It's another level. So if I can be just a slight role model to someone else, or if I can help Shauna Brown or Emily Scarrett, Ellie Green at Harlequin, she's young herself, like just encouraging people to be there for other people and have that community. And it's what rugby's about. We talk about it being a second family, and that's what I like to take away from my international or even club duties, to then take that onto the field on a Sunday morning in the wet and the wind.
One of my truly most enjoyable moments on the show was talking to Monika Bielskyte. She really challenged us to think very differently about the future.
Yeah, I mean, she's part of this new wave of futurologists who aren't just projecting from the present and extrapolating out what they think is going to happen. She and others are taking this protopia approach to reimagine a positive future that we could create. It's a much more kind of intentional way of thinking about things. Very interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think the original framing of protopia and better futures, not ideal futures, but better futures, and this notion of progress, was predominantly limited to technological solutions. Now, I could have tried to invent another word, but I thought that the word was really, really powerful in its root as well, right? Because it comes from, in the way he coined it, it comes from the word pronoia, which is the opposite of paranoia, which is this feeling that the entire world is rooting for you, which could be delusional too, but I think it's a good feeling to have when we try to think about the future. What really spoke to me is that beginning sort of, protopia as proactive prototyping. So the difference between that and utopia or dystopia is that utopia and dystopia tends to be some kind of end idea. That's the end destination. Dystopia, everything has gone wrong. There's nothing you can do about it. You might as well just make peace with it and consume while you can't consume, right? Utopia says that, well, it's this perfect idea of the future. Don't you dare question it. Because if you might actually start questioning, the whole house of cards could collapse, right? And both of them generally tend to be top down. And in both of them, generally, people that already are currently in positions of power remain in positions of power. So the way I see utopia and dystopia is not really as a binary or as something, two notions at the opposite side of the spectrum, but really as two sides of the same coin. It's just what do you flip? And I think it's perfectly illustrated when you see movies like Minority Report, that was a surveillance state dystopia, making it into, especially when there was this whole mixed augmented reality craze. And even right now with the metaverse, making into every second VC pitch deck. Movies also like Ready Player One, which is clearly a dystopia we should not be emulating. Right now, that's the whole rage in the metaverse conversation.
And then we had the celebrated neuroscientist, Anil Seth, and he joined us to talk about his latest book on consciousness being you.
Yeah. Every neuroscientist guest has really opened my mind, and there was something in particular about Anil that just kind of blew my mind wide open. Let's have a listen.
I don't like to think of my brain as this as this information processing device. It makes it less embodied. It makes it less real in some way. And it also leads, there's one other central idea in this metaphor of the brain as a computer, which is that then consciousness becomes something that you can simulate on a computer and give rise to consciousness by simulating. So for some things, this is true, right? If you program a computer to play chess, it's actually playing chess. Computer that plays chess. But if you simulate a weather system on a computer, say you're into forecasting storms, something like that, you have a very fast computer, you simulate in great detail how a hurricane develops. Now, it will never get wet or windy inside the computer. It's always only going to be a simulation, however accurate, however detailed it is. Consciousness might be more like the weather than like chess. It might not be something that can be simulated in all its detail. You might actually depend on the stuff, the real stuff that's inside our skulls. And that's for me, one of the big questions. I don't have an answer to that question, but I don't want to assume an answer one way or the other by taking a metaphor too far.
What's become one of our most downloaded episodes of season 3 was none other than my friend Rob Murray, who brought a deeply human dimension to our conversation on leadership.
Yeah, and it started with a very personal picture of the challenges that he faces and the growth he's made as a person and as a leader. It was a truly emotional show.
Yeah, he modeled the kind of vulnerability that he pushes for in his work, and it was really helpful for me, honestly.
And so I work with companies that are struggling. We want a great culture, and I work with a lot of professional sports teams. Well, they want a great culture, but not at the expense of winning. Mm-hmm. So if they can take an insecure 20-year-old who has massive father wounds or mother wounds, and they can be deeply channeled towards becoming a machine, they're like grateful for the opportunity. Now, they won't say that, and they'll be offended, someone hearing this, but I'm telling you, there are companies that I work with, they have 10, 15, 50,000 employees. And I know in some of those companies, they struggle to see the people who work for them as humans. They say it in concept, but what they really want is people that are driven to prove that they have what it takes by the way they perform. So doing. And you're describing, well, we want to meet your spouse or your partner because we want to get a sense of your being. So there's the being and the doing. And my work is helping. I don't have a prejudice towards either. I want to integrate both, the head and the heart, the being and the doing.
Next, we were joined by Steve Killelea, who pivoted from being a very successful entrepreneur to doing something meaningful about none other than world peace.
Yeah, just a small thing to take on. And he talked about setting up the World Peace Index, which I honestly didn't know anything about until we spoke with him. And that became a key resource for leaders around the world to understand the stability of countries and their potential to slide into war. Isn't that fascinating?
I was in northeast Kivu in the Congo one time looking at the funding a project there dealing with fistula tears for women. And it's one of the more violent places in the world. And I suddenly started to think, what are the opposite of all these stressed out countries I'm working in? And was there anything I could learn from more peaceful countries which could bring into my projects? And it was a fantasy sort of question, but a lot of great ideas start with fantasy questions, don't they? Just the mind rumbling away in the background. And so I did a search on the internet when I got back to Sydney and couldn't find anything. And that's how the Global Peace Index was born. But that creates a very, very profound question. Because a simple businessman like myself can be walking through Africa and wonder, what are the most peaceful nations in the world and hasn't been done? Then what do we know about peace? If you can't measure something, can you truly understand it? If you can't measure it, how do you even know whether your actions are helping you or hindering you in achieving your goals? You simply don't.
And Azeem Azhar, that guy gave us much to think about in our conversation about the realities of an exponential world.
Yeah, including this widening gap between how those technologies are changing it, but they aren't being matched by much of the population's understanding, including our politicians and leaders of institutions.
You know, I think the most interesting new companies will emerge on the other platforms that I talk about in the book. That, you know, I mean, Apple is going to be interesting, and Apple will continue to produce great devices, and some will be turkeys, like the 20th century Spartacus Mac from whatever it was, 1993, 94, or the Apple TV, or the sort of HomePod that came out. I would expect, you know, the kind of constant improvement of audio as a platform, and people will continue to buy them. There is enough momentum in these companies. You know, when Microsoft totally flubbed not only the internet and mobile, it was still producing the dominant operating system in the world. I mean, these are not just super tankers, they're super tankers moving at several hundred miles an hour. So I think they'll go off and they'll do those things. You look at Amazon, it's the third biggest logistics company in the US now, the biggest cloud provider and the biggest bookstore, and I think they'll continue to do that, but they will find themselves under more regulatory scrutiny than Apple. But the mentality of getting into every part of the home for the reasons that these companies care about. In the case of Facebook, it's advertising through the network. In the case of Amazon, it's getting you to go back and pay for something on the store. In the case of Apple, at least there's a little bit more human centricity about what they do. But I think we'll come back in 10 years' time, and we've had our first $1 trillion climate-oriented, whatever a $1 trillion unicorn is, a trunicorn, which is Tesla. I would have thought that in a decade's time, the really exciting companies will be at these intersections of the other exponential technologies that I touch on. So think the new biology, in energy. I'm sure we will see companies that are building grid-scale virtual power plants by harnessing spare storage capacity in our electric vehicles that will look really, really exciting, that have a collective public benefits angle to them. I think what we'll be doing with manufacturing in a decade where 3D printing is essentially doubling in performance almost every 2 years, just over every 2 years. So that's 4 or 5 doublings, 16 to 32-fold improvement in a decade. I think those will be where interesting companies will emerge. These big companies will be even bigger than they are now, subject to regulatory pressure.
For me, one of the massive highlights was perhaps my favorite book in the summer holidays, The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy Paul. I loved that book and I really enjoyed having her on. She was so warm and insightful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was one of my favorite reads of 2021. And having her on the show this year, she proved to be, so generous with what she shared with us on the show. And, I feel really empowered by some of the things she says. I'm a fidgety person by nature, and I always kind of felt a bit embarrassed by that. But I feel like she gave me permission to be a fidgety person because it actually helps me to think a little bit better. So let's have a listen.
I was so fascinated to learn about interoception. I'm sure some of your listeners at this point have heard about it. I had not heard about it. Of course, we've all heard about gut feelings and the idea, we're all familiar with the notion that there seems to be a kind of knowledge or wisdom that emerges from the body that's not quite conscious or top down. And it was fascinating to me to learn that this is the subject of a lot of very exciting and dynamic research right now, looking at what these signals are, these internal cues, where they come from, how they're processed, and really what information they carry, what they can tell us. And what I came to understand was that, as we go through our daily lives, we're taking in so much information, processing it, storing it far more than we could, process or store on a conscious level, but we are doing so on a non-conscious level. And then, so to get access to that information, it's the body that kind of, as I say in the book, is kind of rung like a bell. When we encounter a situation that we've encountered before, the body sends us cues and messages. It's kind of tapping us on the shoulder or tugging on our sleeve, if you will, to let us know, this is a situation you've encountered before, and here's how to handle it.
All right, folks. Well, if these highlights have stimulated you, please subscribe to The Evolving Leader, where we will continue to bring you challenging and insightful new ways of thinking about the future of leadership. All right, say goodbye, John.
Goodbye, John.
And remember, the world is evolving. Are you?